Hello everyone, welcome to Session 12 of LTEC 676, Social and Ethical Issues in Educational Technology. In today's lesson, we're going to talk about three things. First, I want to discuss or introduce augmentative and alternative communication technologies. From there, I want to summarize Chapter 7 of Alpers' research findings in her book Giving Voice, and we'll close out by examining her recommendations for technology developers. So let's get started. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about augmentative and alternative communication. And of course, this is part of what we should know as educators who are thinking about the role of educational technology in education and in society. So what are augmentative and alternative communication technologies? Well, first we have to start by defining augmentative and alternative communication. And these are communication systems, strategies, and tools that replace or supplement natural speech. These systems, strategies, and tools support people who have difficulties communicating using speech. Now, let's break it down into the two halves, augmentative communication and alternative communication. So what is augmentative communication? Well, this is when people supplement or add to their speech with something, such as signs, symbols, or a letterboard, in order to make their message clearer for the listener. In contrast, alternative communication is when people are not able to speak, or their speech is not understandable, even when they add something to it. In this case, they need a different way to communicate. So, what are the benefits of augmentative and alternative communication? In general, when a person cannot speak, giving them a tool or a strategy to communicate their thoughts and ideas and desires is really a powerful form of enabling their communication. Some of the benefits that have been described through the use of AAC include stronger friendships and deeper relationships, increased autonomy and decision-making, increased independence, more respect from others, more employment and volunteer opportunities, as well as improved physical and mental health. So let's take a look at some of the technologies related to augmentative and alternative communication. So one of the examples referenced in Alpers' book, of course, is Proloquo for text, which you can see here is an app for Apple's iOS and their iPad technology. This is a product that's developed by Assistive Where, and you can see the description here. But generally, it's a way of using text to create speech. And off to the right-hand side here, you can see they use sentence prediction. Users can actually type in words, and then they also have quick talk buttons to help you find quick answers to things. This is a technology, or this is software that's designed for people who can already write. And interestingly, this app is pretty expensive. It's $119. Now, Assistive Where creates another product that is symbol-based AAC. This is for people who don't necessarily have language skills yet. And this particular app is called Proloquo to Go, and it's symbol-based, meaning people don't necessarily have to be able to read and write. They can use the pictures in order to create sentences and to communicate. And so you can see, if you look closely at the screenshot, the squares or the cards that are in orange are pronouns such as I, you, it. The ones in pink are verbs such as I do or I want. The ones in green are prepositions such as to, on, in, out. And using these cards, individuals can type out sentences, and the application will then synthesize that into speech. And so let's take a look at an example of an individual named Ruby and how she uses Proloquo to Go. Let's just watch a minute or so of this particular video.
I first met Ruby 2 years ago when she started school, very much in her own bubble. She was the youngest premature baby in England. She was described to me as a very challenging case.
I want computer, please. Mrs. Holly Green.
Good girl. Since Ruby has had the iPad, her behaviour has improved 95%. I would be getting hit 20, 30 times a day. where now is I've worked all day today and she doesn't hit me at all. The iPad and the software is allowing her to unlock her communication and communicate with me. And on a daily basis, she absolutely amazes me. It's your turn. No, it's Sophie.
Will be
We
my
haven't got
turn.
Sophie on here yet, have we? You ready? Yep. What we've just done for the first time is got Ruby and Sophie to share using My Turn. So they're learning to use the computer and share toys. Ruby's not very good at sharing.
So you might be thinking, well, why are we talking about AAC? Well, of course, this has to do with equity in education, which has been one of our primary topics this semester. And we know that there are two dimensions to equity in education. First, on the one hand, we have fairness, ensuring that personal and social circumstances are not obstacles to achieving educational potential. And obviously, people with speech disabilities or disorders who can't communicate normally, that is a personal circumstance, and it should not be an obstacle to achieving their educational potential. The second dimension that we know about equity in education is inclusion, ensuring a basic minimum standard of education for all members of society. And we've already talked about that technology has a role in both fairness and inclusion in relation to equity in education. So that's why we're talking about AAC. So now let's take a look at Alpers Findings in her book, Giving Voice. So what did she set out to do? Well, she's really talking about looking at technology through the lens of disability. Now, last week we talked about the technology hype cycle as defined by Gartner. And I would argue that Alpers' in-depth qualitative analysis is sort of an antidote to the peaks and valleys documented in that hype cycle. The peak of inflated expectations and the trough of disillusionment. Alper is really going slower. She's going deeper in trying to give us a more nuanced analysis of the role of communication technologies as seen through the lens of disability. So her book really centers on the social implications of communication technologies that purport to give voice to the voiceless. She explores the varied meanings of this phrase, giving voice to the voiceless, through the critical lens of disability. Alper notes that too many stories focus on objects, the technologies, and not the people. And this happens, she claims, when mass media frame mobile communication technologies as a medium for voice, tool for finding voice, and a metaphoric key for freeing a caged voice. She really frowns upon the media's framing of mobile communication technologies in that way. She argues that they're focusing on the objects, the technologies, and not the people themselves. And that leads to oversimplification that really leaves people out of the equation. And that's really dangerous when we're thinking about equity in education, in particular, fairness and inclusion. She also notes that technological tools may selectively amplify voices within and across various publics and audiences, but that their existence does not automatically call the status quo of structural inequality into question. In other words, these tools can amplify voices in different spaces within society, but there's a danger that the mere existence of those technologies in a few select voices doesn't necessarily call into question the structural inequalities that we've been talking about all semester. What structural inequalities? Well, the things that we've been talking about, such as racism, the patriarchy, different class levels, misogyny, and homophobia. What Alper's book is doing is questioning utopian visions of technology. And that's important to us in our thinking about the two dimensions of equity in education. The question, or the questions, that Alper sets out to answer is, how do parents manage their child's use of hardware and software, as well as other communication technologies? And how do they incorporate media into their family's daily life at home, on the go, and in the community? That's really what she wanted to set out to know. She was sick of headlines and mass media oversimplification. She wanted to go deeper. What are some of the things that she found? Well, she found that the parents were united by the label of special needs parents, but at the same time, they were divided by social class. She also found that technology itself did not give voice, and that the term voice is an overused and imprecise metaphor, one that abstracts, obscures, and oversimplifies the human experience of disability. So as folks interested in the role of educational technology in education, we have to keep in mind that using the word voice might obscure or oversimplify the human experience in relation to fairness and inclusion when it comes to equity in education. In addition, Alper noted that the parents' ability to mobilize social, economic, and cultural capital shaped the extent to which their children could not only speak but also be heard. In other words, there were social, economic, and cultural factors that influenced whether or not the children really embraced, leveraged, and benefited from the existence of different hardware and software technologies. The mere existence of the tools didn't necessarily give them voice and or allow them to be heard. Finally, Alper notes that mobile technologies, largely thought to universally empower people by giving voice to the voiceless, particularly individuals with disabilities, are still subject to disabling structural inequalities we often do not hear about, and as a result, are assumed not to exist. Again, Alper is pointing out that mobile technologies are not immune to the disabling structural inequalities that we already know exist. And that's an important point for us to be thinking about as educators focused on how to get the most out of educational technology. Now, Alper ends her book in chapter 7 by focusing on a few recommendations for technology developers. And I think these are very important and things that the next generation of technology developers, or more specifically, the next generation of educational technology developers, should be keeping in mind. So the first recommendation she makes has to do with voice and diversity. And she argues there needs to be improvement in the design of synthetic speech technologies. She says, as they stand, there's assumptions about race, culture, and gender that are built into those existing systems of technology-enabled voices. In short, non-white and female voices are largely silenced through synthetic speech systems. So she really challenges us to expand the range of human voices embedded in machines, and that not only has implications for assistive speech technologies, but also all of the artificially intelligent systems that humans interact with. Secondly, she said there's major issues related to data and privacy. High-tech AAC devices keep track of everything a person says, but in an untraditional way, because they actually store digital records of the symbols or text converted into speech output. And because of this, individuals who use these devices have a unique perspective on important societal issues like data surveillance, counter-surveillance, and personal privacy. And importantly, she notes that disabled individuals are not passively given voices by able-bodied individuals. They are actively taking and making voices despite structural inequality. And therefore, any decisions about their own assistive technologies should include them, and they need to be part of the conversation. Her third recommendation is related to talking machines and listening machines. She notes, rightfully, that there's a lot of valid anxiety about privacy and security issues raised by the Internet of Things. These debates should be contextualized within the larger history of augmentative and alternative communication systems, as these technologies innately involve the practice of speaking through and being in conversation with objects. So it's not like these technologies, talking machines and listening machines, are new just because we have Siri, Alexa, and Google Assistant. Alper wants to remind us that there's a rich history here that we should be drawing on. And finally, she points out that artificially intelligent talking toys and their intersections with AAC might also influence the design of educational technology more broadly. Her fourth and last recommendation has to do with the tone of synthetic speech. And she notes that most voices in AAC systems have a neutral reading style, which does not reflect the full span of human expression through voice. And importantly, she argues that tone of voice is not secondary or optional, but essential for being understood by others. And because of this, there's a need for more creative, human-centered design research into how tone of voice in AAC devices might be expanded. And she extends this argument to thinking about the role of emoji and emoticons in relaying emotion exclusively through visual communication. She asked the question, but what should emoji actually sound like in different languages and spoken through synthetic speech systems? It's questions like these that we need to be thinking about as we keep an eye on and develop the future of educational technologies if we are ever going to come around to fairness and inclusion, the two dimensions of equity in education. Okay, everyone, that's a lot to digest, and we're out of time for today. Have a good week, and I'll see you in Canvas.